You guys doing good this morning? It's good to see you guys. Those of you that may be here for the first time, my name is Brad. I'm one of the pastors here, and so we're just glad you're here, glad you're hanging out with us today. And we're continuing on in a series that we've been in for the past several weeks. I'm going to continue with that this morning. The ushers are going to receive the offering, so if you brought that with you, you can take that out. And we're going to continue talking about this idea of cruciformity, which the whole idea behind this series is essentially to say, what is the spirituality of Jesus, and how do we enter into that? Jesus didn't come to make us believe something about him as much as he was asking us to enter into something that was a result of what we knew to be true about him, that we were going to live a life that looked a particular way, that is lived a particular way. And this whole series of cruciformity is essentially saying we live a life that is shaped by the cross, by what Jesus did for us on the cross, and it reorients us in many ways to how we live our lives. First of all, we've talked in this series about how we see ourselves differently. There's a cruciformed identity that changes how we understand who we are. There's a cruciformed way that we now live towards God, and we live in faith towards God, a particular way that is different once we understand the cross of Christ. I'm going to revisit some of those ideas a little later in today's message. And then for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about how we live out our lives as cruciformed community. How do we live towards others around us? How do we live towards people in our lives? And in a strange way, I think that this part of this message is really one of the more practical dynamics to this. Like it's, you can apply this like starting today. In fact, this week I got a text from a friend and she said, yeah, I was in this horrible situation at work and it was, things were not going the way in this meeting. And I just took what you talked about on Sunday and I applied it and it worked, which I was kind of surprised by her surprise, but yeah, it does. It works when you apply this stuff. So there's a very practical nature to this, but I have to also say this. It is incredibly contrarian to where our culture is moving. It is very contrasted to where our culture is. The things we're talking about and how we live towards others, I think we can understand cruciformed identity. I think we can understand cruciform faith. It's very easy to move from where most of us are to understanding those things. But when it comes to how we live towards others, what Jesus presents is so radically different from our culture that it's incredibly difficult to break with that. In fact, this morning I shared in the first service a story. And I shared it, this is always weird. My parents go to Summit, and they always go to the first service. And every now and then I tell a story, and I realize as I'm telling it that I'm sharing something they didn't know that I hid from them when I was in college. So that happened in the first service. I was telling this story, and I looked at my parents like, oh, great, like they don't know this story. So what I'm about to tell you, after the first service this morning, my mom ran out and chased me as I was getting in the car to come up here, and she goes, I need to tell you something. And I was like, what is it, Mom? I got to go. And she goes, I did the same thing when I was in college. When I was college age, I did the exact same thing, and I hid it from you guys because I never wanted you to do this. So here's what has been apparently happening in my family for generations. Outside the outskirts of the city of Phoenix, which is where I grew up and where I went to college, outside the city of Phoenix, there are these massive canals that funnel water from all over the state of Arizona to the Phoenix area to give water to the millions of people who live there unnaturally every year. People shouldn't live there. It's not meant to be. But, so there's all this water, right, that's coming in from all over these different places. And so my friends and I at night, we would drive out, when I was in college, we would drive at night out to these places, far out in the desert, and there were these fences that had signs on them. But because it was dark, we couldn't read that it said no trespassing. And so we would just duck under these fences, we'd break through them, and we would hike through the desert down I remember going down this one hill, and there was this place where all the water came together, and it was joining in these massive canals that were traveling, the water's traveling really fast. And there was this one particular spot where the water had to cross a massive ravine. There was this huge ravine, and they built a bridge that went across the whole ravine, and then this concrete trough that shot across the entire thing. And so the water would be just mashing into this one tiny little spot and then firing across. And we would, my buddies and I, we would climb up on the I-beams of this bridge, and it was narrow enough you could drop into it as a person. And so we would dangle our feet and feel the water, and it was just pitch black dark. And then we would get up the courage, and we would just, boom, we would drop into this thing. We'd take this position, and it would just shoot us. You'd be flying as fast as you could. At one point, it got enclosed. That was always fun when you're basically a human being in a pipe going somewhere. And then at the end of it, there was this like open part where it opened up into a really massive wide canal. And usually, you know, like your friends would throw you a rope so that you wouldn't end up in like the Gulf of California or something. And so we would do this. We would just drop in and it would shoot us. And there was no resistance to this. And the reason I tell you this story is that I think for a lot of us, we're sort of thrown into culture. We're sort of thrown into life, and it's like being dropped into this flume of water. Culture's going somewhere. It's moving a direction. That's something we all need to understand, that culture, society, whether it's this society or some past society, cultures and societies, they move in particular directions. There are rhythms and there are themes and there are places that groups of people go. And for us, for many of us, we just sort of end up in life and we don't realize we're being carried along in a particular direction. And yet, ironically and interestingly enough, I think as culture is being carried in one direction, it longs to experience something that's in the opposite direction, and it's something that the cruciformed life offers humanity. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed this, but our culture in particular is moving a particular direction these days. And the movement of our culture, the way we're flowing as a society, is towards division. You notice this? It's kind of pretty easy to pick up. I think in my nearly half a century of life, I have never seen a nation as divided as this one is right now. Progressive and conservative, Democrat, Republican, black and white, LGBTQ and straight, rural and suburban, rich and poor, West Coast, East Coast, like you name it, like people are just like, we don't like you, I don't like you, you know, everyone, you're wrong. No, I'm, you know, like everybody's just fighting, right? And it seems to be getting more and more angry. It's getting more and more accusatory. It's just getting uglier and uglier. Culture is moving towards divisiveness. We're divided, with an exception. We do have unity every now and then, and this is a sad fact that we have to state this morning. We do find unity in opposition to others. It seems like the only time we find unity these days is when we're opposing another group, when we find other people who agree with us and will oppose another group with us. That's when we find unity. Rarely do we find the unity of commonality that we should have in Christ. The rhetoric of our current age indicates that we are essentially unified in our hatred of anyone that believes differently than us or thinks differently than us or sometimes even looks differently than us. So is there a place in the middle of this motion, is there a place in this movement in this direction where the cruciformed life gets traction and begins to shift the currents? Is there a place, is there some way that cruciform people are called to live that actually offers some sort of alternative to this? Maybe even a solution to this? Like with the anxiousness and the fearfulness and the anger, is there something somewhere in a cruciformed life that could actually create a shift in the direction of where things are headed? Is there something that we're capable of because of what Jesus does in us? Is there something we're called to be because of who Jesus has called us to be that could break down what the New Testament writers refer to as this wall of hostility? Is there something about this? These are some of the questions I want us to answer today. But I want to answer this with a specific principle that Jesus is going to talk about. And here's the deal. The reason we're talking about this is not just simply because the principle Jesus presents is something that applies on this sort of socio-political spectrum that is really important for culture. It's also a principle that gets traction in our everyday lives. Like it gets traction in where you and I are living every single day. The principle we're going to look at today, it is practical for families. It's practical for the way parents are relating to their children and the way children relate to their parents, whether those children are children's age or adult age, right? That's something a lot of children and parents need to figure out, how to live together after you're out of the house, right? I'm just saying that from practical experience right now, okay? That's just... It's also something that applies to marriages. Like this principle is something that significantly influences the way marriages function and operate. It's a principle that I think applies to neighborhoods, how neighbors live with one another. It applies to school campuses. It applies to school board meetings and decisions. It applies to toxic work environments. Like this principle that we're looking at today literally has an impact on every aspect of our life as it relates to other human beings. This principle comes out of a teaching of Jesus that I want you to look at with me this morning. It's in Matthew chapter 5. And it's interesting because this is one of those teachings of Jesus that is really clear, and yet at the same time, it is really ignored by most of us. If you have a Bible, Matthew chapter 5, we're going to look at two passages that are related, that are both in this particular place. And as you're turning there, if you don't have a Bible, the words will be on the screen, so don't worry about that too much. But Matthew chapter 5 is essentially an MP3 of one of Jesus' sermons, which we don't come across very often. There was obviously no MP3, there's no CD players, 8-track players, or reel-to-reel during this day and age. And so every now and then, Jesus preached a really great sermon, and people were like, man, we'd like to have that book on tape. And so they wrote down what Jesus preached. And so Matthew chapter 5 is one of the rare recorded sermons of Jesus, start to finish. He moves through several chapters of Matthew, and it is like Jesus is preaching to this group of people. Now, why he's preaching to them is particularly relevant for us, because this group of human beings that have gathered to listen to Jesus are a group of people who are in a culture that is moving towards divisiveness, just like us. The flow of society, the flow of culture is a bitter flow. It is moving towards people hating one another instead of loving one another. In fact, in this particular time period, the people, the Jewish nation is occupied. Israel is occupied by the Roman Empire, and so there is this political infighting that's taking place. There are revolutions and rebellions that are constantly rising up and being squelched by the Romans during this time period. There are ethnic issues that are rising in this place. The world is becoming pluralistic at this particular moment in time, and so people are fighting within their own ethnicities. There's all sorts of conflict, and everybody's trying to separate, and they're nationalist in their views. Not only that, even religiously or in terms of faith and spirituality, there is fighting going on there. If you've read the New Testament, you always hear about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Those two groups were equally unified against Jesus, but what we often forget is that those two groups were like two denominations that were fighting about who was right and who was wrong. So there's religious fighting, ethnic fighting, political fighting, like everyone is fighting, right? Everything is divided. And there's this group of people who are just like, there's got to be another way to live. Like, there's got to be another alternative than you and I just having to choose which side we're on and then picking up stones and throwing them at each other. And so Jesus gathers this group of people on a hillside, and he's saying, this is what I have come to offer. A third way, a new way to look at the world. Not an either or, a new way of understanding things. So in Matthew chapter 5, he begins to preach, and he preaches this message and starts with 9 bullet point, rapid fire statements about what it looks like to experience the kingdom of God. Then when he talks about the kingdom of God, he's saying, what does it look like for you and I to participate in this new thing that God is doing? What's it look like to be a cruciformed person? And every one of these 9 statements makes almost no sense with the current flow of culture, with the movement, the current that is carrying culture along. It is in direct opposition to it. This morning, we're just going to look at the 7th one. It's found in verse 9, Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Jesus is talking about how we experience life in him, and he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Peacemakers. Peacemakers. It's pretty clear. Blessed are the peacemakers, right? He doesn't say, blessed are the passive aggressive, right? He doesn't say, blessed are those who keep their mouths quiet in public, but bash people behind closed doors. He doesn't say, blessed are those who rally with those who agree with them and think they're right and tell everyone else they're wrong. That's not who's blessed. Blessed are those who have a corner on the truth. No, that's not what he says. He doesn't even say, blessed are those who just keep to themselves and stay neutral. He doesn't say that. He says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. It's really interesting that this word peacemaker, it's the only place in the New Testament that this word is found. Peacemaker. Jesus created a word. He can do that, by the way. peacemaker. You are a maker of peace. What's also interesting about this is how broadly he applies it. Jesus is not specific about the location or the timing of this. He doesn't say that the peacemaking is something that happens in the socio-political realm, that when it comes to hot button issues in culture, you need to be a peacemaker. He also doesn't say, oh, in the context of your home, this is just, you can't control what happens over there, but in your house you can. So be a peacemaker in your house. With those that are closest with you, be one that makes peace. No, Jesus looks at all of it and he says, if you want to experience this life in me, be the kind of person who makes peace everywhere. Rather than picking sides and joining in the fight, be the person who resolves the conflict. Be a peacemaker. Be a peacemaker. There's this peaceableness that is about you. There's this ability that you have to not engage in the fight. There is this capacity that you have to somehow stand in the middle and not join in. He doesn't say you're just peacekeepers. He says you are peacemakers. You are creating peace. Your role in this world is to resolve the unrest, to put an end to the hostility. Followers of Jesus make peace between warring sides and warring ideas. They're not appeasers, they are peacemakers. This is radically different than what most of us have heard about what it means to be a Christian. It is being known as a person who puts an end to hostilities, does not join in with them. Now, if you've been here for this series, you know that cruciform people, they take the posture of a servant. That's how this is made possible. We're here to serve God and his purposes. In fact, several weeks ago, Kelsey preached about how we live towards God, and one of the ways we live towards God that's different is we now serve God, and God doesn't serve us. God does not exist to serve our every want and need. We exist to serve God. That's the dynamic of being a cruciform person. So we serve God and his purposes. So the next question then for us should be, well then what are God's purposes? What is God actually all about? What's the business of God? What has God gone to great lengths to make possible for humanity? And the answer is peace. Peace. I love this quote from Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. He says, God has made peace. He has humbled himself in his Son to produce it. That is why peacemakers are children of God. What they do is to repeat what God has done. See, on a day like today, on Father's Day, I think it's important that we understand why we use the imagery of God as our Father. We hear this? Our Father who art in heaven, right? This illustration of a heavenly Father. He doesn't say that for his sake, like he needs us to call him Father. He says that for our sake. It's not about his identity, it's about our identity. And those words being spoken into this culture were particularly relevant because children did what their fathers did. They did the business of their dads. And so when we are being called children of God, it's saying we are peacemakers. Why? Because God is a peacemaker. He makes peace. And if you want to be a son or a daughter of God, then you jump in on the family business. Amen? So then you wonder, well, how does this peacemaking take place? How does it look? I want to take the rest of our time and talk about a few principles with this. How do we become people who make peace? Jesus, it's almost like he kind of knows we're going to wrestle with this because human beings, we are naturally given towards division and fighting and I'm right and you're wrong. And so Jesus says, I'm inviting you into something that's completely different, which by the way means I'm going to have to give you some different illustrations. So in Matthew 5, shortly after he says this, a few verses down, he tells a little bit of a story, gives us an example of what peacemaking looks like on a day-to-day practical level. And I think it confronts a misunderstanding we have about how we become people of peace and sons and daughters of God. It says in verse 23, he says, so, here's an example. If you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come to offer your gift. Now, I'm not sure we understand the significance of what Jesus just said. because we hear the words offering and altar, and in our culture we think, well, offering is that thing that happens right when Brad starts to talk, and the altar's the stage, right, that Brad stands on, or the band is up here, right? We don't have a real good understanding of what Jesus is referring to until we think a little deeper about what we know to be true. So when we talk about altar and offerings, the language, what is that describing? Well, it's describing the centerpiece of Judaism. Remember that the Jews had this entire sacrificial system that was oriented around us making peace with God. You make peace with God. You are reconciled with God by engaging in the sacrificial system. All the stuff we read about in Leviticus with bulls and goats and blood and priests and altars and fire and all that stuff was the stuff that people did to worship God. People did that stuff to connect with God. And so when Jesus talks about this moment, he's not talking about some random one in 52 weeks worship service at Summit Church. He's talking about that day when a person has saved up their money or they've brought their best calf and they brought it to the temple and they're about to offer this thing. Jesus is talking about the ultimate expression of worship, and he says, listen, if you want to be reconciled to God, don't worry about that. Leave it there. Walk away and go get reconciled to the people in your life. Go make some peace, because that is how you become sons and daughters. Notice he says first. Last time I ran any sort of race, first meant something, right? I know for some people in some cultures recently, first is sort of nebulous. You all won, but for those of us that are adults, we know that first means something, right? First means first. There's a sense of priority. There's a sense of order. And Jesus is saying the priority, the order of your life, if you want to be sons and daughters of God, is that you would make peace with the people around you. I would rather you make peace with the men and women in your life than keep coming to the altar and offering me these religious rites and engaging in these rituals and these sacrifices. If you want to be about God's business, be a peacemaker. Be a peacemaker. Is it easy? No. That's why Jesus is teaching on it. That's why Paul talks about it, and we're going to see that in a minute. I love this. Stanley Hauerwas, who until recently was teaching at Duke Divinity, he said this. He said, "This is not a stratagem for getting what we want by the only manner of life available now that in Jesus we've seen what God wants." Like, okay, I guess I have to do this, be a peacemaker because I want what God, whatever, right? We seek reconciliation with the neighbor not because we feel so much better afterward, but because reconciliation is what God is doing in the world in the Christ. God is about reconciling people, and so cruciformed people who are following the way of the cross are engaging in the ministry of reconciliation. So the whole point of this is the multiplication of peace. Jesus brings peace to you, and then you bring peace to others. That's what we see on the cross. We look at the cross and we say, look at the great lengths that God has gone to so that you could experience peace with him, to reconcile you. It's a symbol of God's commitment to peace. And it's the pattern through which we deliver that peace. How do I become a peacemaker? I follow the pattern, the example of the cross. In a little bit this morning, we're going to take communion together. But I want to explain some things about communion because it connects with how we become the deliverers of peace. How do we become peacemakers? In the scriptures, it's written again and again that we're supposed to remember and be thankful. Remember the cross and be thankful. Remember and be thankful. There's a Greek word for thankful, and the Greek word is the word eucharismai. Kind of a fancy, fun word, right? You guys want to say it with me this morning? Just say eucharismai. Let's say it again because it sounds so fun. Eucharismai. Eucharismai sounds like what? The Eucharist, right? It sounds like the Eucharist. In fact, the Greek word eu, which means well or good, is merged with the word charismai, which means to give or to grant. It's to give good. It's a good gift. So this is the word that is used to form the word Eucharist. So the point of the scriptures that's being presented over and over again is that Jesus is God's eucharismai. He is God's gift good gift to the world. On the cross, Jesus' body is broken and his blood is poured out. The pouring out of his blood is a good gift to the world. So God makes peace with the world and with you and with me through the Eucharist, the good gift of Jesus. So, Christians like us, people that are followers of Jesus, that gather in a room like this, we take part in this ritual month after month, year after year, century after century. We engage in this thing that has been called the Eucharist in a traditional form. It's been called communion. It's been called the Lord's Supper. But all of it is a way of us remembering or returning to who God is. But it's not just who he is, it's what he's done and how he's done it. He's peacemaking through sacrifice. And just like any other ritual, the Eucharist, it's not just about participating in a ritual, it's a symbol pointing to something bigger. Now, what is that? What is the Eucharist pointing to? Well, the Apostle Paul was writing to the church at Corinth. I'm going to use several examples from his writings there because Paul models this on so many levels, but he shows us something that I think is important that we need to understand about this cruciformed life. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he says this. He's talking about his life and kind of his present condition, and things are really looking good for Paul. That's sarcastic because listen to what it says. He says, we're afflicted in every way. Way to go, right? We're afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Listen to what he says. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. We carry the Eucharist in us so that the Eucharist can be modeled out of us. We carry the death of Jesus in us so that others can experience the life of Jesus through us. So things have been difficult for Paul, right? It's really clear. But he doesn't complain. He's not discouraged. He's not frustrated. He's not saying, God, you're not doing things according to my plan. He's like, no, instead he says, we carry this around in us. I carry this. I'm participating in this. See, Jesus allowed his body to be broken and his blood to be poured out. And so Paul says, my participation in this is that I would allow myself to be broken and to maybe even spill a little blood, so that other people could know what I know, the peace of God. Now, some of this, he's actually literally being flogged and being beaten, but he's actually speaking of something deeper, isn't he? He's speaking of a whole way of life. He has committed himself to a cause that is larger than himself. He has become a peacemaker. And it's hard. And sometimes you lose. And sometimes you get broken. And sometimes you get frustrated. And sometimes you get betrayed. And sometimes you don't get your way. And sometimes you don't get to throw the final card and say, I win. But he continues on in verse 11 and he says, for we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. Do you see how backwards this is? I'm not fighting you to prove that I'm right. I'm actually sacrificing for you so that you can have peace. It's a completely different conversation, a completely different way of living. That's how the Eucharist works. For somebody to receive, somebody else has to what? They have to give, right? For someone to be fed, somebody else has to provide food. For someone to be inspired, which means life is being given to them, somebody else has to pour out their life to inspire them. If someone is going to benefit from anything anywhere, somebody else has to sacrifice or pay something somewhere else. So God gives the world life through the breaking of Christ's body and the pouring of Christ's blood, and then God continues. He continues this work through the body of Christ, which in this exact same letter, do you know how Paul refers to the church, to the same group of people? He calls them the body of Christ. So the body of Christ is the Eucharist, and then Paul says, oh, by the way, the body of Christ is the Eucharist. The church is the living, good gift to the world that is following the same pattern of Jesus. It's why in 1 Corinthians he writes this. Listen to the way that he enters into this. He says, to the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. And he says, I've become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I don't know if you noticed that Paul missed something here. Like if I was editing what Paul was saying, writing, I would have corrected him because he was contrasting. And then he left something out because he was talking about those being under the law, the Jews, and those being outside the law, the Greeks. And he goes, to those that were under the law, I was under the law. To those that were outside the law, I was outside the law. Those are two contrasted statements, right? You have under the law and not under the law. And then he goes to this other idea of weakness. And he says, there's weakness, and then on the other side of weakness, the opposite of weakness is what? Strength. Notice that Paul does not say, to the strong I became strong. Why? Could it be that Paul understands that the power of the Eucharist comes in laying down the life, sacrificing, giving up, offering ourselves, not getting our own way? Could it be that the power is in the weakness, not in the strength? I think it's fascinating that during this time period, the temple in Jerusalem was constructed in a very particular way for a very specific reason. There was plans that people had followed, but those plans meant something later on to people. In fact, in the temple, in the center of the temple, sort of the centerpiece of it, was a place called the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is where God, as the Jews understood it, God dwelled in the Holy of Holies in a very unique way in that place. God was the God of the universe, but there was something unique about this spot. And then outside of the Holy of Holies was this other part of the temple area where there was the altar that Jesus was referring to earlier in Matthew chapter 5. There was this place where the priests would gather and they would take the sacrifices of the Jews and they would lay them out and they would have the fire, the blood, and all the different rituals of Leviticus in that place. And then outside of that particular place, there was the court of the Jews. And this was where the Jews who wanted to worship God would gather, and they would be in this specific place for themselves, and they would worship God. But then on the other side of this, there was a wall. On the other side of this, there was another court, and it was the court of the Gentiles. Because there were Gentile people who weren't Jewish, who knew who God was. They wanted to worship God. They wanted to be a part of this whole thing. But in the structure of the temple, they were given this outer court. This outer court, when you walked through the outer court and you came to the wall where you entered into the Jewish portion of it, there was an inscription that said, if you're a Gentile and you cross this point, we're going to kill you. Pretty subtle, right? Like, you're out here and we're in here. Think about the implications that this has on your psychology as a Greek person, as a non-Jew. There's us and them, right? So you might love God, but I don't really love you guys on the other side of this wall. And vice versa, right? Not only that, look at the symbolic statement it's making about your relationship to God. If God is all the way over here and you're way out here, what does that say about who you are? This is why the words that Paul speaks to the Ephesian church are so powerful when he says this. He says about Jesus that he himself is our peace, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. Jesus eradicated the dividing wall of hostility. He's about reconciliation. And why? He is creating one new humanity. He makes peace through his body, that through this body, peace might be made. Chrysostom said this. He said, for in fact, this was the crucial work of the only begotten, to bring together things divided and to reconcile the alienated. See, the Eucharist, communion, this thing we're about to engage in, it is about the new humanity. It is about us becoming the new humanity. It is about us receiving peace and becoming deliverers of peace. We become the new humanity. We walk in someone else's shoes. We spend time in a room with people who the only reason we would gather is because of who Jesus is and the peace we have with him. We learn, we grow, we discover that people are far too beautiful and far too creative to simply be labeled with simple terms or to be judged in simple forms. We discover these things as the new humanity, and then we begin to live out a new sort of way, a new way of living, a third way of living. Jesus says to people who are in a culture that is flowing a particular direction, he says, there's a way out of this. There's a way that you can live in your family, with your kids and your spouse and your coworkers and your educators and your neighbors. There's a way that you can watch the news and not get caught up in all the stuff that's been eroding the souls of people for centuries. There's a new way to live, and I want you to experience that. This morning, you're going to hold a cup and a tiny wafer in your hand. And I'm going to just ask that you would take a moment today to consider, are you a peacemaker? And the reason that Jesus gave us this symbol was so that we could physically experience and be reminded of the peace that has been made with us. But equally, he gives us this symbol to remind us that we ourselves are peacemakers. And so today, when we eat and drink, which, by the way, have you ever thought about the reality that Jesus invites us to eat and drink, to ingest the symbol? Could it be that in the same way we experience the peace, it now flows out of us to the world around us? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the sons and the daughters of God. We need to be reminded of our call to be peacemakers. Amen. I'm going to invite the ushers to come and distribute the elements, the cup and the bread. The band's going to sing a new song this morning, just some words that might remind you of the importance of this. I'll encourage you just to take some time to reflect. Maybe it is that you remember a brother that you have an issue with this morning, like I have, and you realize, I need to be a peacemaker. Maybe you realize that there are some things that need to change in your attitude or your heart. I want to give you that space to do that this morning, and then in a few moments I'll come back up and we'll take the elements together. So Jesus, when he sits with his disciples and he encourages them to do this thing, says, I want you to do this. When you gather, I want you to take the time. I want you to remember and be thankful. I want you to remember the Eucharismo, the good gift. He's beginning with them a practice that says, I'm going to live my life in a way of remembrance. I'm going to live my life in a way that says, peace has been made with me so that I can join the conspiracy and make peace with others. Amen? So in the same way that they took the bread and ate, together we eat. In the same way that they took the cup and made a commitment to being peacemakers themselves, we drink and become peacemakers. Would you stand with me? Jesus, we thank you for the peace you have made with us, the model that you have given us, the symbol that stands before us, the truth that is in us. We pray in your name. Amen. May you be sons and daughters because you do the business of your Father. May you be peacemakers in a world of division. Amen. Amen. Love you guys so much. Thanks for hanging out this morning. Dads, have a great day. We'll see you guys all next Sunday. See you later.